Knowing that a lot of the tons of these people that come to the courts are addicts in some form, what actually happens when they first hit your courtroom, and how do you make those decisions?
Well, procedurally, when they first hit the courtroom, they're usually arraigned, and there's a determination as to whether or not there's going to be an entry of a guilty plea or an entry of a not guilty plea. Obviously, if they plead not guilty, then the process proceeds to trial and trial motions and that sort of thing. And then ultimately, there's either an acquittal, a dismissal, or a conviction in some form. Or the majority of the criminal defendants that come in front of the court come in at the arraignment, negotiate some kind of a plea agreement, and enter a guilty plea in some form. And then their case basically is scheduled for sentencing. Usually they have been either in jail or released prior to jail for probably 2 to 3 months before I even see them initially, and then it usually takes another 2 to 3 months before I'm in a position to conduct a sentencing proceeding, whereupon there's a requirement to have a pre-sentence investigation prepared by our Department of Corrections. That provides the court with the information that I then will have the opportunity to recognize that they have the substantial problem that they may have that factors into the sentencing.
Families are a huge issue, according to the polls, when it comes to these addicts. In looking at all of the cases that you deal with all the time, dealing with addicts and alcoholics, can you go back and with all these reports and say, boy, it looks like they really have a family problem, and discuss that a little bit?
Well, I've been a district judge for 5 years now. I was a magistrate judge, dealt mainly in misdemeanor offenses and a lot of family law for 14 years before that. Prior to that, I was engaged as a criminal defense attorney, and then prior to that, I was engaged as a prosecuting attorney. And so over the course of 30 years involved in criminal litigation, I can say without a doubt that there's a very substantial involvement of substance abuse issues in these criminal cases. But even more than that, there's what I've always characterized in terms as a responsibility issue, that there's a very common theme that runs through all of these cases where the criminal defendants that find themselves in trouble and are unable to get themselves out of trouble in any kind of reasonably successful fashion have issues with personal responsibility. And as far as I'm concerned, issues of personal responsibility go back to your upbringing, and obviously your upbringing is going to be connected with the family values that have been instilled in you. I used to remark when I did juvenile work, for example, where the juvenile would come into court, for example, and he would be wearing his ball cap still, and he'd be chewing gum in front of the judge, and he'd be slouched back in his seat. And I, of course, would be concerned and offended about that, and then I'd look and see his father, who was seated next to him at the counsel table with his ball cap on, chewing gum, slouched back in his seat. And it obviously doesn't take a rocket scientist to make the connection between why this young man behaved the way he did in that kind of a setting. I would never be caught dead, or at least I wouldn't have walked out of that courtroom very healthy if I had done something like that in front of my father. I just think that there are certain values that need to be instilled in people in order to allow them to have the tools to deal with life's problems. I mean, we're all going to run into problems. Some people, hopefully, if they have the proper foundation, are going to deal with those problems in a positive fashion. If you don't have that foundation, if it hasn't been instilled in you either by a limited family of quality or by an extended family that aids you in instilling those values or that character or that level of personal responsibility, then there's very little hope that you're going to learn from your mistakes and be able to achieve some level of rehabilitation, in my opinion.
How many people that come through your courtroom are meth related, as far as the drug addicts that come into your court?
The current caseload that I have to deal with is extremely heavily loaded with the methamphetamine problem. That is clearly the primary strain on our criminal justice system here in Kootenai County.
Why do you believe that to be so?
Well, I think that historically drug use has basically followed some kind of a pattern. Back in the 60s, I suspect, there was the experimentation and the oncoming of a lot of different drugs, but primarily marijuana, and then ultimately psychedelics like LSD. And then later on, it seemed like in the 80s we had a real influx of cocaine use that was part of the system. I think that the expense of manufacturing and transporting cocaine The fact that it could only be grown, for example, in South America and then transported up to our communities in the north was certainly logistically difficult. And the stimulant effects of that are relatively similar in a sense to the stimulant effects of methamphetamine, which all of a sudden could be produced in somebody's garage or in somebody's kitchen.
For a lot cheaper.
For a lot cheaper and a lot more degree of availability, and you essentially cut out the middleman. And the popularity of methamphetamine, I think, has grown exponentially once the recognition was there that it was a much more logistically easier drug to obtain.
What do you think is the answer to this? If you're going to try to sum it all up, is it to take away the ability to buy it? Is it to try to just change the character of the community? What's, in your opinion, what's the answer to this?
As I like to do. Well, I think that realistically, you're never going to be able to create a situation where human beings are not going to be inclined to partake in drugs. I think that's going to occur. It always has. It always will. And especially in our society, when you look at our society is just inundated with drugs, whether they're legal or not, as a solution to problems. I mean, this morning when I was getting ready to come to work, I don't know how many penile erectile dysfunction advertisements I saw on television. If you get a headache, you're supposed to take aspirin, or body aches, you're supposed to take Advil. Whatever indigestion problems, as a society, we're geared up to be consumers, and if we have a problem, we fix that problem with a drug. And I think when people have problems and stress in their life, that's an easy thing that they turn to, and that's going to happen regardless. And so I think any governmental effort to believe that you're going to completely eradicate drug use, I think is just a myth. It's just not going to happen. And I think to a great extent it's a waste of resources. And so I think we need to take on the problem in a different fashion with that assumption that drug use is going to be a fact of life, if you will. We can certainly impose very stringent penalties and maybe even make the penalties mandatory and put drug offenders in prison, for example. We can certainly make a harsh effort at interdiction and go after the drug dealers and the manufacturers, if you will. But I think every time you put somebody away from manufacturing methamphetamine, somebody else is going to step in their place and take over. And so if you realistically want to tackle the problem, I think you need to tackle the root of the problem, which is often the inability of the individual to reconcile the effects of the substance abuse problem. And I think the root of that problem goes back to essentially what we're talking about: personal responsibility, families, the morals, the character, the values that are instilled in that individual that give them the tools to deal with life's problems without having to resort to the use of controlled substances, or any kind of a substance for that matter.
The role of the community in this, if you were going to say something to the community as far as just last-ditch effort, you're going to have some last words to the community. What can we do to help you?
I'm not really sure what the solution is. I know that the taxpayers of the state have to at some point in time make a decision what they want to do. If they want to simply approach this problem in the traditional sense of punishing the offender to deter the offender from further conduct, then I think the taxpayer has to recognize that we're going to have to increase the capacity of our jails, and the taxpayer is going to have to be willing to foot the bill for that. Right now our penitentiary is swollen, it's overcrowded, and I don't have the specific statistics, but I can assure you that a major part of the problem are the drug offenders that are positioned and institutionalized in our prison system. I think that there's no simple solution. I think that there needs to be a very concerted effort from a lot of different resources. I think the counseling and treatment and rehabilitation community, the experts, so to speak, need to be more readily available. Right now it's extremely difficult for the court to access what I would consider to be legitimately recognized drug treatment programs. Despite the fact that this is such a burden on our system, I will have a criminal defendant in front of me who has no financial resources, and yet I don't have any state resources available to me to provide treatment for this individual. The individual may very well scream and cry out for treatment, but unless I send them to the state penitentiary, where they would be required to spend at least a year and a half to be eligible to complete the therapeutic community, the inpatient program there, or unless I were to enter a retained jurisdiction sentence and require that they spend at least 6 months in the Cottonwood facility and have the benefits of the New Directions program, which both of these programs are overcrowded and there's a substantial waiting list. Those are really the only two legitimate resources that I have as a judge available to me. The other would be whatever the community has to offer. And I think that is where the big breakdown is. If we can attack the problem in those cases at that community level, we may not need to utilize the inpatient resources through the state of the New Directions program or the therapeutic community as much as we're forced to do so now. It's very difficult for me, even on a defendant who's on probation, to be able to be put into some kind of an intensive outpatient treatment program because there's simply no state resources available, there's no private resources available. And I think that we really need to adjust our thinking to focus on the bottom end of this system. If we keep building more prisons on the top end, we're not eliminating the bottom end. That is the
core of the problem.
The core of the problem.
And
so I think that the community resources that are available at the community level are just lacking. And whether these are state-funded treatment programs, whether they are community resources, whether they're church resources, whatever they are, I seriously think that we need a much greater emphasis on those sorts of resources, because if we can treat the person within the community, they're going to have to come back within that community at some time regardless of what we do with them. And I think our ability to expect a success at that community level is going to be greater if we have the resources. But unfortunately, I think those resources are seriously depleted or lacking.
A lot of the ones that are coming out of jail are going right back into the jails, or you're finding in your courtroom people that are reoffending and reoffending and reoffending, and you probably see this a lot, right?
We call them the frequent flyers, and that is very true. We see the same individuals on a regular basis, particularly with the methamphetamine addiction, and I don't think I speak just for myself, but I think most of the judges try very hard to avoid having to send a drug addict who has no other crime but simply possession of drugs to the penitentiary. And so we often try to work with them on the community level as well as we can with probation services, and ultimately in many cases are forced to have to impose a prison sentence. But before we get to that point, we see them a number of times, and that's very common.
Should a program be set up, if it's going to be done, especially through community, which because the courts don't have really the jurisdiction on a lot of this, do you think that we should try to include the whole family in for the rehabilitation of that particular person and try to surround the whole family at that particular point?
Well, I think that to the extent that you have control over the whole family, I think any efforts that could be put in that direction certainly can't hurt and probably would help. One of the problems that I often see is that I have a criminal defendant come in front of the court who has some substantial controlled substance issues. And their family will even come in and say, "Judge, my son needs treatment. He doesn't need prison." And that may very well be true, but unfortunately there's no magic pill. It's almost the same mentality that got them into the addiction in the first place. You know, I had a bad day, so I'm going to snort some meth. I have a problem. Fix me. It doesn't work that way. I mean, you can go to a hospital, you can go through your programming, you can learn all about the drugs, you can be dried out, but when you walk out that door, you still have the same brittle foundation that you had when you walked in. And if we don't work on building that foundation, we're not going to really legitimately work on that drug problem. And if that foundation means that the family value that that is lacking needs to be worked on and reinforced, then that certainly would be an area that we need to deal with. As we visited earlier this morning, I was going over my sentencings for today, and we have these pre-sentence reports that are prepared by our Department of Corrections, and I get real depressed when I read them over because they all say the same thing. The defendant usually is missing a parent. They have an abusive step-parent that they grew up with, a neglectful parent that they were raised in, perhaps even an abusive, sexually abusive environment. Their parents were not employed, so they are not employed. They don't maintain employment. Their parents may not have completed high school, so they have not completed high school. And the story goes on in terms of that deficiency in the foundation that makes it very difficult for them to be rehabilitated. So it's not a quick fix.
What is it that we can do to help you and to help these, the judicial system with this?
Well, I think that the general public needs to be properly educated to begin with, because unfortunately our politicians are elected on a get tough on crime philosophy and campaign. And if our general public believes that that is the solution, then we better be prepared to put a lot of people in prison and spend a lot of tax money. On the other hand, if the people are educated to the fact that the real problem starts at home and starts within the community, that's where we can hopefully provide the resources and focus the resources to try to address the foundation of this problem. And I think at some point in time, the public has to learn and understand that this is how we attack the problem. And it's a real difficult issue. I mean, I'm certainly a strong believer in law and order. I'm a very strong believer that you should be responsible. I'm not one who is going to forgive somebody for their criminal conduct because they were high on drugs. I may work with them because they are high on drugs and that's all they've done wrong. But if they've gone out and stolen or they've hurt somebody because they were on drugs, to me that doesn't excuse their conduct, and that conduct needs to be punished. But for these people that are simply addicts, we need to get the community involved in trying to eliminate the reason behind the problem or the reason behind their inability to resolve their problem. And I think that can be done at the community level. And I think we really need to focus our resources in that direction.